Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about my father and his links with Bexhill. And as many of you know, he spent the last 35 years of his life here, although he started off somewhere rather different. As his name indicates, he comes from Wales, or came from Wales. Now, I'm going to start with a picture just to remind you of him. There you are, that is from GoldenEye, Q surrounded by all his gadgets. So, what actually brought him to Bexhill? And why did he end up here? Well, the answer to the first of those is pure chance. It was a job. And the answer to the second, my mother. But it's not a simple story. It's not just, boy meets girl and they settle down in Bexhill. It's a bit more complicated than that. But it all is linked, really, to my mother's family, which has been around in this part of the world for a long time. Our links, well, there have been members of my mother's family here for nearly 200 years. Right, this gentleman. He is Richard Day, and he's the younger son of William Day of Hadlow, my 4 times great-grandfather, and he is a Sussex landowner. Richard is a younger son, so he needs to find somewhere else to live, but he's lucky. He seems to be quite a rich younger son. And he was born in 1800, and in 1830 he married Jane Duke. Now, Jane Duke comes from Battle, but Duke is quite a sort of common name around. There are a lot of dukes from Hastings, and I noticed there was actually a duke at that celebration dinner for old age. So I suspect that that is why he began looking for somewhere round here. It's a bit far from Hadlow, but it's nice and near to Battle, and I think Dukes ended up in Hastings as well. So in 1831, he bought, and I'm going to quote from the Manor Roll, a mansion house with a cottage called the Gardener's Cottage, Upmeads, coach house and stable, Heriot Lodge, and 2 pieces of land, being the residence of a tenement called Rosier's, and also all that piece of land called Linkwell, being part of a tenement called Cheeseman's. And I should just explain that tenement here is a sort of small holding. It is rather different from the Scottish tenement. So you have already seen these pictures. These are Rosier's, which is the house that he bought. This is the picture of Linkwell. It is a beautiful house, and it is lovely to live in, particularly in the summer. It does mean that even however cold it is and however we shut the windows, ventilation is never a problem. Let's go back to Richard Day. Richard and Jane had 2 children, Mary Jane and Augustus. Richard died comparatively young. He was only 45, and he's buried in Barrack Hall Gardens. There is a sort of big tomb in the middle, which has been left intact. And Augustus, his only son, was only 29. He died in 1863, which left Mary Jane Day. And Mary Jane never married. Now that is Mary Jane there, with her coachman, Charles Jolliffe. Now, she never married, but she didn't exactly live alone. The 1891 census shows that she lived with a cook, a parlourmaid, a housemaid, and a kitchen maid. And we also had Charles Jolliffe and his wife living in Heriot Lodge, and there was a gardener and wife living in Upmeads. But apparently she went out on a ride in her carriage every day, and you could set your clock by it. Well, Mary Jane died in 1812, and her cousin Agnes Tuckwell inherited Linkwell, and she'd been born Agnes Day in 1857, and she was the last day actually born in Hadlow. And got an Irishman, a guy from west of Ireland, Montague Cather, and had 2 children, Leonard and Mary Agnes, always known as Molly, my grandmother. And she then married Philip Tuckwell, so that's why she's Agnes Tuckwell when she actually comes to Bexhill. And she obviously moved into Linkwell pretty quickly, because that summer in August, yes, Molly married Charles Pantlin with a reception at Linkwell. And he was a well-known rugby player, and then actually was a reserve for Ireland. I would almost certainly been capped if it hadn't been for the First World War. Now, Agnes and her children were all very strong supporters of women's suffrage. And there we have Agnes driving a carriage, I think in London, and you will see that she is arguing strongly for votes for women. And her children were also the same way inclined. In fact, I mentioned my grandmother's wedding. There's a newspaper account of it, and one of the newspapers says, "The bride is a prominent suffragist, and although she has not yet suffered imprisonment for the cause, she is well known as an eloquent speaker at suffragist demonstrations and as an earnest worker in the militant section." Now, she never did get sent to prison, but Joan Cather, her sister-in-law, was not so lucky, because in March 1912, she was sentenced to 2 months hard labour. And this was because she was participating in a major action by the militant suffragettes to break windows. And clear that Joan broke a lot of windows. And when she went to prison, she went on hunger strike, which is what suffragettes tended to do. And she was then awarded a medal by the militant group, the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, who provided these medals for all women who were imprisoned, and particularly those who were force-fed. And her medal is in the British Museum. But you have to be careful to track it. It's quite difficult to track down, because the medal is for Joan Cather, but she took the precaution of going to prison under a false name. Because there is a roll call of honour for the suffragettes who suffered imprisonment, which my grandma had a copy, which I've inherited. And I remember looking and thinking, where is Joan? Because my mother had always told me Joan had gone to prison. No sign of her. So I was relieved to find that Josephine Carter is on that list. And Joan definitely did go to prison. Leonard, her husband, was also a strong supporter, and he was secretary of the Militant Men's Society for Women's Rights. He also worked for another group which were very keen. Well, they were the church group for suffrage, which then sort of morphed into a campaign for the ordination of women, and this is sometime in the 1920s, which is remarkably early for that. The organisation didn't last very long, but it was worthy while it was going. And this, of course, as far as Leonard was concerned, was slightly interrupted by the First World War, because he was a naval officer who'd retired from the Navy and was called back and served throughout the First World War, and in fact was the senior survivor of HMS Goliath, which was sunk in the Dardanelles in 1915. So he went back to all this after after peace was declared and he'd been demobbed. Now his mother, Agnes, died in July 1920, and Leonard inherited. But he and Joan never had children, and the house was rather large and quite drafty. So he always lived in Upmeads, and it seems that actually he wasn't very keen on Linkwell, which is a pity, because despite its disadvantages, it is a very nice house. So it was let as a school. He still owned it, but he let it as a school, and there you have a photograph just showing, well, you can see what they're doing. Some of them being allowed onto the beach, the picnic, and others marching around in a rather healthy way. It would have been a very small school, and I think it specialised in children from colonial families. And my wife Georgia did meet one man who'd come down to show his granddaughter the house he'd been at school in. And if I remember rightly, he had been brought here when he was 5 by his mother. He boarded, and she remained in the country for a year, and so he did see her. But then she went back to India, and he didn't see her again for another 3 or 4 years. Right, I will now move to the other half of the talk, which is about my father, because at the moment I've given you why his connection with my mother had brought him to live finally in Bexhill, but I've said very little about him. So you're going to see a picture of him, which I suspect you will not recognise. That's about 2 or 3, I should think. He had very nice blonde hair, apparently. And he was born on the 12th September 1914, christened Desmond Wilkinson Llewelyn. And his parents were Ivor and Maya Llewelyn, and they were first cousins. And as far as the background is concerned, I think the easiest way of describing it is simply to quote from his parents' marriage certificate, because it says, profession of the bridegroom, mining engineer. Profession of bridegroom's father, mining engineer. Profession of bride's father, mining engineer. This, of course, was coal mines. This was the heyday of the coal industry in South Wales, which is where Ivor and Maya lived. They lived a very comfortable middle-class life. Ivor he was a colliery manager at Risca. But that was largely due to Ivor's father, who was called Llewelyn Llewelyn. Now, Llewelyn Llewelyn was born a long time ago, well, about 1840. And he was a collier publican, which means that he not only was a miner, but he ran a pub. Well, I suspect his wife did most of the work in the pub. But when Llewelyn was 9, his father was killed. There was a major pit explosion at a place called Letyshenkin, and I think it was 52 miners were killed. The youngest involved in the explosion were 11. I think there were 2 or 3 11-year-olds. Which meant that, he was an orphan from there, and his mother was left with 5 children to look after. But luckily, she kept the pub. He was obviously a man with great drive and ability, because he rose from there. He became a mining engineer. He became a colliery manager, both in Wales and in Chile. He became quite rich, and he ended up High Sheriff of Monmouthshire. And he had 6 sons, I think, 5 of whom ran collieries. So that's the sort of the Welsh background as far as his father was concerned. And his mother, Maya, well, her grandfather had come down to Wales from Durham. They were an English family. And Llewelyn actually married Jane Wilkinson, who was Maya's aunt. I said they were first cousins. So it actually meant that my father was more of a Wilkinson than he was a Llewelyn, but that was never something that he would really admit to. He, as was usual with people of his background, was educated at boarding schools from about the age of 8. He wasn't academic in any way, but very interested in rugby and interested in acting. It was difficult because while he was still at school, his father died. I mean, Ivor had a weak heart. He retired only 45 in 1920, and he died 10 years later. And my father, well, Meyer did not think it necessary for my father to come home for the funeral, which I think he found quite difficult. But in I think 1934, he left school, not sure what he was going to do. Various uncles had ideas. I think accountancy was mentioned. I think it rapidly became apparent it wasn't a brilliant idea. And he went to RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And graduated in 1936, and his first job was in repertory theatre in Southend. Now, in those days, there was not really much television at all, so if you were a young actor, the way you trained was you went into repertory theatre. And it was a very hard life. You were doing, if you were in weekly rep, you were doing a performance every night, apart from probably Monday or Sunday. You had one night off, and a couple of matinees. During the day, you were rehearsing the play for the next week. And in your spare time, you were learning the lines, so when you went to those rehearsals, you were word perfect. That was the idea anyway. But it did give actors an immense amount of experience. Let's move on. Now that is him. He's 23, I think. Or younger, no, he's 21. Unfortunately, not his car. Now, in the next year, March 37, he moved to a company called the Matthew Forsyth Players, which were slightly more upmarket, and they were a travelling company, which meant they played in various resorts. And in 37, he went to Torquay, Southport, Scarborough, various places. But in September, he came to Bexhill for the autumn season at the Delaware Pavilion. And there you have the programme for the first production that they did when they came to Bexhill. And it is the day after his birthday, so he would have been 23. And this is, in some ways, this is a sort of a slightly family production, because it's by a woman called Diana Morgan, and then by Robert and her husband, Robert McDermott. And they became great friends of my parents, and Diana's my brother's godmother. And among the cast is a guy called Derek Tansley, who I think was the reason my father joined the Players in the first place, because he was already there. And he was another godfather. Well, he was my godfather. I'm going through godfathers in this, it's rather fun. So that was the first play he was in. But for this season in Bexhill, Matthew Forsyth clearly decided he needed a larger cast. And so he was recruiting a few extra actors. Among them were Phillida and Diana Pantlin, who were my mother's sisters, younger sisters. They were identical twins. By this stage, Molly and Charles, who remember the ones who got married in Bexhill, were living in Battle, well, in London and in Battle. He was a businessman. And that is basically how my father met my mother. Now, stories differ slightly as to exactly how they met. There's one story in his biography, and I had a slightly different version from my mother. But they all basically say that the key to it is that Diana was quite keen on my father and invited him either to tea, or he invited Diana to a party. Anyway, my mother was involved and met my father, and they got on well. And in May the next year, they got married. And that's their marriage in London. And they went on honeymoon in France, and then back to work. Back to Matthew Forsyth, back to acting. In 1939, he was actually in a television program, which was quite interesting. First television program he'd been in. Very, very few people saw it because hardly anyone had a television, but it did show the way things were going to go. Then he had a job in Oxford, which was very promising because it was a sort of a step up on provincial rep, a bit closer to London. But then war intervened, and he joined the army. Now, he was very keen determined to join, but actually the beginning of World War II was not like World War I. Not lots of volunteers. There was conscription introduced straight away, and if you wanted to join up, you were told you had to wait your turn. It would happen. But there was a sort of way around this, and there's an irony in all this, because the reason Desmond was able to do it was because he disliked being in the army at school. The school he was in had a cadet force, as most public schools did, and it was compulsory. And the only way you could get out of it was to pass an exam to show that you sort of basically trained and knew all the basics of being a soldier. It was called your Certificate A. And if you did that, you could go and, well, he could go and be a Boy Scout, which was a lot more relaxed. So he did that. And then he found that if you had a Cert A, you could be fast-tracked to commission. So he was able to join the Artists' Rifles, very briefly, and then he went to an officers' training camp at Sandhurst. And that was, in fact, the first one at Sandhurst for temporary officers. So he succeeded, was commissioned then in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in 1940, and after 3 months training, joined the 1st Battalion in France. And his active military service was like his part in many Bond films. It was brief but memorable. Because when Germany invaded France on the 10th of May, he advanced with the RWF into Belgium and shared in the exhausting retreat when the British Expeditionary Force was outflanked by the German advance. And back in France, the Fusiliers counterattacked, and his company took the village of Robeck before in turn being overwhelmed by the renewed German attack on the 26th of May. And the commander of the opposing 3rd Panzer Division wrote in his report, "The English company who held Robeck made an extremely excellent impression and fought with great courage and nerve." It didn't really help. He was captured and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Germany. But he was always very proud of having served with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he was honoured in 1997 when he was invited to join in the unveiling of a memorial to the 97 members of the 1st Battalion who were killed between the 23rd and 27th of May in and around Saint-Venant. And what they did, I mean, that sort of action did help delay the German advance and thus did make it more possible for more troops to be rescued from Dunkirk. So it was not in vain. So he was a prisoner of war for 5 years and in 4 main camps. But despite what it says in Wikipedia, he was not in Colditz. He said it was, the real problem was it was extremely dull. You had to make your own entertainment. And for the first 6 months, they were extremely hungry, really until food parcels arrived, because the food they were given was not adequate. He did try and escape from one camp at a place called Warburg. He and a number of others spent 6 months digging a tunnel and were just about at the end and about to get out when it was discovered, which put him off, I think, for the rest of the war, because it was rather depressing. So what he did a lot of was acting. There were a number of other professional actors in the camps, And the German authorities were very helpful. I think their view was that if their prisoners were acting, they were not escaping, they were not making trouble, they were not being awkward. Therefore, they would provide clothes and costumes and props. And I think they probably provided a photographer, because I have a number of photographs of performances, all very high quality, and these were all sent back as postcards to my mother. And you can see on the back it's stamped with, the particular Auflag that they were in. And one of the plays, perhaps the most interesting of the ones he was in, I'm jumping. This is a cartoon produced in prisoner of war camp. You can see Desmond Ham Llewelyn, Michael Goodliffe, another professional actor, Dan Cunningham, professional actor, another of my godfathers. I never met him at all. And you've probably heard of Douglas Bader. Well, one of the plays that they put on is this Post-Mortem, and this is the world premiere of a play by Noel Coward. Because Noel Coward wrote it in 1931 and decided it wasn't actually going to be a very good play to perform, so he'd just publish it. So it was published, but never acted. But then they got permission to put it on in prisoner of war camp, so they did. So, this was in 1944, war was coming to an end, and he was finally liberated in 1945 by the Americans. And is back in England on the 8th of April, 5 years to the day from when he left. So this brought, obviously, a reunion with my mother. Must have been difficult. I mean, they hadn't seen each other for 5 years. Obviously, they'd been corresponding, but quite difficult at that range and with all those constraints. But doesn't seem to have been a problem. A lot of time to make up. One of the problems was, of course, he knew very little about the war. I mean, my mother had been in the army, she'd been in the ATS. An awful lot had been happening over 5 years, most of which he didn't know anything about, nor had he experienced. So I think it was, it was quite difficult, just establishing, relations and how you can have common ground between yourselves. Anyway, that was a problem that so many people faced. Most of them were successful. Right, this is him in 1947. Yeah, back to acting. Series of, small roles and things. It's quite a difficult job being an actor. But, he coped. One film that he was in, very pleased with, was They Were Not Divided, which is a film about the Welsh Guards at war. He played 7 Jones. He was playing a Welsh tank driver. One significant thing for the future, it was directed by a guy called Terence Young. And we'll come to him later. The other significant thing that year was that I was born, followed by my brother in another 3 years. And at that time, we were living in Chelsea, which was not smart at all. But with many weekends in battle, see my grandparents, and visits to Bexhill. I do remember coming here, particularly my grandmother had a hut on the beach. And I do remember driving past Linkwell, except I was never conscious of Linkwell. And this is really because there was a pet shop where the OTPS is now based. And I always wanted to see what was in the window. Anyway, things were about to change. First of all, he was in Cleopatra, which was an experience. Now, this is him as a Roman soldier, but you won't see him as a Roman soldier because all that was cut. And he was also a senator, and I think he got about a line in the end, but he was there for, I think, 5 months. So he had quite a pleasant time in Rome. From Russia with Love, the first Bond film he was in, directed by Terence Young, which was a help. Now Terence, because last time he directed my father, he'd been a Welshman, thought that Q ought to be played as a Welshman. My father wasn't at all sure, so you have to excuse the Welsh accent. But he said, "Are you sure, Terence? It'd be something like this, would it? Right, see, now you got this briefcase, you press this button, and out comes a knife." So Terence sort of said, well, no, perhaps not. So Desmond played it as a much more conventional, in fact, he played it rather as a sort of 1940s British officer, with a slightly clipped voice, and I'm sure you've all seen him in a 1950s film. And the interesting thing is, if you listen to him much later, the later Bond films, the voice is totally different. And I suspect you'll find that with a lot of actors. In fact, a lot of people. The great advantage of having an actor as a father is you can actually hear his voice. So now we get on to Bond films, and I need the crib more than ever. The next one is 90s Goldfinger, which is really important because they introduced the Aston Martin. Then 1965, he was in Thunderball. Thunderball was a great experience for him because it was shot in the Bahamas, and they wanted him there as wet weather cover. Now, wet weather cover is there so you've got somebody you can film if it rains. Except it doesn't rain much in the Bahamas. So he was there for, I think he was there for 6 months, and they shot it when he got back to London. It was also the year that we moved to Linkwell, because the previous year, my uncle Leonard had basically handed the house over to my mother. And he died, in fact, the same year. The timing wasn't perfect because it was all arranged, and then my father buggered off to the Bahamas, so leaving my mother to sort absolutely everything out, which she wasn't that keen on, but she did do it, and we moved. And that's when the 35 years I was talking about begins ticking. Bond films again. Yeah. This is just showing you another gadget. Little Nellie from You Only Live Twice. And that was in 1967. Now this is nice because this is not Bond. This is Follyfoot. I don't know if any of you remember Follyfoot. Children's program, went on for 3 seasons, I think, starting in 1971. And he played the Colonel, who basically owned Follyfoot and the stables, and was there to intervene when things went really wrong. I had a lovely time because it was in the country. He could ride, plenty of horses, and he was being paid, which of course is a great thing for an actor because it doesn't always happen. And he also had time off in his contract to go and do Bond, and forgotten which was. Diamonds Are Forever, which was significant because he went on a publicity tour of America. It was the first time he'd done it. And this is really important because this is what he tended to do later. And the thing about Bond films, if you're doing, is they're usually, certainly as far as he was concerned, he was never, they're all short. And if you're an actor, you're basically paid by the day. So if you've got an efficient director who manages to do the whole thing in a couple of days, I mean, for example, Russia with Love, he did 1 day and he got paid £30. So, contrary to expectations, you do not make a fortune in films unless you're an A-lister. But you can do quite well if they want you to do a publicity tour, because that takes up a lot of time. This is Live and Let Die. This is one of the gadgets that was used. And the trick bit is that it wasn't in Live and Let Die. They decided that they did not need Q in this film, which was deeply depressing for him. He wondered whether that was it. But it was apparently all because there were two producers of the early Bonds, Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli, and they rather fell out, and Harry Saltzman wanted a different direction. Anyway, later on, Cubby Broccoli did the whole lot, and he liked having Q. And this is A View to a Kill, which is basically there because I like the picture. And it's got another of my godfathers in. Geoffrey Keane, like most of my godfathers, I think I met Geoffrey once, but he did send me £50 when I went to university, basically saying that he's sorry he'd never done anything up till then, but he hoped this made up for it, which I think it did. It was probably rather better than having lots of presents when you're a child to get sort of 50 quid when you're 21. You can use it better. But yeah, having actors as godparent is not basically a good idea. I think I've jumped Octopussy, which I wanted to mention because it was quite important for him. In a way, it was a sort of breakthrough because he did a major tour of Australia with my mother. So they both went for lots of premieres in Australia. But it meant that Bond was beginning to, well, he was 69. And I think it reconciled him to the fact that he really was being typecast. This came up a bit in Follyfoot. He obviously wasn't typecast because they did Follyfoot, but he was cast. But there were some of the papers would make little jokes like, do they realise at Follyfoot that their colonel is actually in the Secret Service? And I think that would have got worse. So by 1983, Octopussy came out. He basically accepted that his role in life as an actor was to be Q. And there was plenty to be got from doing that. So let's just finish off with a few things about him and the last sort of 15 years or so of his career and his life. In 1992, he and my mother decided to move out of Linkwell, and Georgia and I went down to live there. They decided that it was time to downsize, and it made sense that we had a growing family for us to move in there. And in fact, we moved first, and so we were 6 months together while they were doing up Osborne House, because they moved just across the road. It was very convenient. And we all lived together for 6 months. But by 1994, my mother was showing increasing signs of Alzheimer's. I think the move was difficult. But she was managing. In 1995, then we had GoldenEye, the first Pierce Brosnan film, and also This Is Your Life. They did This Is Your Life for my father, which just before the premiere, which we were slightly apprehensive about because obviously it was a secret as far as he was concerned, but we had to make sure my mother was able to attend and was happy to do it. And she was getting a little more frail. Anyway, we managed successfully. She did that. She did the premiere. And that is them at the premiere. And the previous one I have up just because it shows him characteristically at that time. He was actually extremely busy. I mean, he had a new agent, a constant stream of promotions, advertisements, things like that. He came quite difficult to keep track of. I remember asking him, would he be there for lunch on Sunday? Because he was a slight sort of pause, and I think I'm going to San Francisco. Yeah, good. Or he turned up, we thought he was in Paris, but he still came to supper. But yeah, this was all just after my mother went into a nursing home, which she had to do in 1996. It was difficult, but he couldn't cope. And it was made easier by the fact that Mummy actually thought she was in a nursing home. She complained to me at one stage. She said, "The staff in this home are very nice, but they're not very competent." So, well, having mentioned my father, I think I should just say that I haven't really done my mother justice. I mean, she was the real link with Bexhill, and she was the core of his marriage, the core of his life. She was always there for him. Yeah, she was a lovely person. And I'm just going to finish by reading, in fact, what I said at his memorial service, because it does pick up some things I haven't really said, and I think are important. The many letters we received when he died left me with two abiding impressions. One was his gift of friendship. Many people who met him only briefly regarded him as a friend, and he made good friends in all walks of life and in all parts of the world. The other is of his kindness and generosity. He was generous in particular with his time. He did an enormous amount for charity, often for small charities with limited opportunities for fundraising, particularly local ones. Going through his papers, I was astonished by the number and variety of charities that he had worked with. And we do meet a lot of people around here who will say, "Oh yes, I remember your father, he came to school, he showed us his bond case. I spoke to him in the street." And he was also involved with local charities. So, I think his bonds with Bexhill were pretty firm. And this is a place that was very close to his heart. Any questions?
Yeah.
If there's time for them.